Hi, I'm Jayda Van with Road Socialist Organization, as well as the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our comrades and friends who are joining us for today's event. As we all know, 2020 was a historic year. Millions of us took to the streets in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. United and in solidarity, we put forth the demands of community control of the police, defunding the police, and an end to the racist system of policing. The unprecedented, spontaneous rebellion that was sparked in 2020 also brought about a broad mobilization of Black voters who played a decisive role in defeating Donald Trump in the elections. For today's Black History Month event, we would like to start the conversation, or rather continue the conversation of how we can move from Black rebellion to Black liberation. We are joined today by leaders in the movement who will discuss what this rebellion means and how we can advance the struggle from rebellion to liberation. Please share this event with your friends on Facebook, and thank you for being here with us. I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Aislinn Pulley from Black Lives Matter Chicago, who we are excited to have here as a guest. Inspired by the Black Panther Party 10-point program, Aislinn will present a new program from BLM Chicago for organizing to demand relief from COVID-19 and the economic crisis, for jobs, housing, community control of the police, and defunding the police. Aislinn.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and having me be a part of this great program. I'm going to share a little bit about the report that BLM Chicago will be putting out soon, which goes over some of what Jayda just explained. And really the central premise of it is to take a qualitative look at the conditions that Black people are facing in this city in Chicago, and what are the concrete things that we can demand right now to begin to mitigate some of the violence, death, and terror that the conditions have resulted. As Jayda mentioned in the intro, over the summer of 2020, we experienced what is largely being commented on as one of the largest, if not the largest, uprising in the history of the globe. An estimated 26 million people in this country participated in protests across states and cities, large and small. A total estimate of about 550 places throughout this country participated in the uprising, including rural areas and places seemingly as far removed from what we consider the normal state of US policing as like Amish countries. In Chicago, protests of over 20,000 people occurred on May 30th. And this continued en masse throughout the entirety of the summer. On May 30th, Lori Lightfoot, our mayor, blocked access to downtown by raising the bridges, shutting off access to public transit, creating roadblocks, which essentially trapped people downtown. That night alone, over 1,000 people were arrested. Over the course of the uprising, over 3,000 people were arrested and over 90% held incommunicado. Lightfoot also enacted a curfew, which then created the legal veil of justification that was used by CPD to then batter as well as arrest thousands and thousands of Chicagoans. And this is during the pandemic. They overwhelmingly were not wearing PPE. And of course, it is impossible to physically distance when detained. However, despite this enormous historic wave of protest throughout this country and throughout this city, even though it activated millions and millions of people to the streets, many of whom for the very first time, what we received in terms of a response systemically were generally platitudes and symbolism. We haven't received any systemic changes. We've had murals of Black Lives Matter painted on streets across the city. However, the murders, the battering, the disinvestment, the gentrification, the disproportionate amount of Black people suffering from COVID and then dying from COVID has not been alleviated. The numbers of millions who have been forced into unemployment has not been alleviated. None of these platitudes have produced any change, any material change in the living conditions of Black people in this country. Black people continue to be in Chicago the leading population who are incarcerated, the leading population who are at the recipient hands of violence by police, the leading population experiencing unemployment, the leading population experiencing evictions and healthcare disparity, and the leading population experiencing death by COVID. Symbolism is absolutely not enough. And so what we hope this program will do is put forward a platform that can begin to move us from where we are, which is in the aftermath of spontaneous uprising, historic spontaneous uprising, to organized movement toward Black liberation. We have divided our platform into sections of our demands, which include defund CPD, CPAC now, healthcare for all, moratorium on evictions, housing for all, free all incarcerated and detained people, a massive jobs program, and ending wars and deportations. Nationally, Black children are 6 times more likely to be shot to death by police than whites. Latinx children are 3 times more likely to be shot to death than their white counterparts. In Chicago, Black and Latinx residents are up to 10 times more likely to be targeted for quote unquote excessive and deadly force. This is according to the federal government. This was in the Department of Justice's and the Police Accountability Task Force's reports, 2 reports that were put forward by both the municipal government of Chicago and the US federal government. So these are undisputed facts, at least according to the system. Between 2008 and 2015, there were 404 police shootings in the city. 74% of those were Black. 14% were Latinx, less than 8% were white. Between 2010 and 2014, Chicago experienced the highest number of police killings in the country and led the country in the killings of Black people by police. Chicago has over 100,000 more police officers per 100,000 people than any other city in the country, which means in effect, Chicago has the most police per capita than any other big city in this country. Chicago also spends overwhelmingly more on its police department than the other major big cities, New York, for example, LA, and Houston. This then is replicated in the divestment of services to our people. So Chicago's political elite have decided to prioritize the protection of the ruling class in Chicago by administering a police force that will violently oppress and suppress poor working people, instead of providing us with the resources that we need, like healthcare. So in addition to being in a global pandemic, Chicago, and particularly on the South and West sides, also experienced healthcare apartheid and pharmaceutical apartheid, as well as nutritional apartheid. So the segregation lines that exist in the city, which is known as one of the most segregated cities in the country, exists on every strata of livelihood, meaning that there are not enough hospitals, there are not enough clinics, there are not enough doctors, there are not enough grocery stores for people in this city, and specifically for Black people and poor people in this city. These are intentionally created conditions that are a result of the political priorities of the political elite in this class, in this city. What we are demanding is a reconstruction of this entire political framework that the city has been governing under, which is continuing to take from us, the people, and giving to the wealthy. What we are calling for is a reversal of this political paradigm and the creation of conditions in the city that will more equitably allow Black people to live and thrive. In addition to all of the conditions that I mentioned, unemployment is increasing. In 2019, in December of 2019, Black unemployment in Chicago was less than 5%. By December 2020, Black unemployment has almost hit 15%. That's almost a triple increase in unemployment for Black people. The majority of the 60 million people in this country who have been forced into unemployment are from the service industry, meaning the poorest of the poor have been forced into deeper and deeper levels of poverty. The jobs report at the end of December revealed that 140,000 people were pushed into unemployment. Of those 140,000, there were no men, there were no white men, and there were no white women. They were all Black and Latinx women. The racialized nature of our unemployment crisis cannot be ignored. Therefore, we need a response that gives honor and takes into consideration the racialized nature of this forced impoverishment that exists in this entire country and specifically in Chicago. And therefore, we need a jobs program that specifically addresses this crisis. So again, lastly, it's only in it's in the second decade of the 21st century that the Black liberation movement has been confronted by an entrenched regime of racist and political repression that has been created precisely to prevent Black rebellion, to prevent and suppress against our historic trajectory of uprising against the conditions of oppression that have been imposed upon us in this country for centuries. We must overthrow all of these conditions. And by doing that, we must name the solutions. This is a first critical step in creating the organizing space for ourselves to be able to build the necessary revolutionary movement that we need to obtain the political objective of Black liberation. Doing this will move us from relying on the spontaneity of uprising into organized rebellion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aislinn. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Symbolism is not enough. And the forced impoverishment, that we see so much in our community, that we see so much in our daily lives has to end. And I'm really excited about your program and what y'all are doing over there at BLM Chicago. And I look forward to struggling alongside of y'all on that. Thank you once again, for being here with us today. To frame a historical perspective, we would like to introduce Kobi Gilroy, from the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, member of Black Lives Matter Chicago, and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. From rebellions in the holds of slave ships to the Haitian Revolution up until today, Kobi will speak about the unbroken chain of resistance of Black people. Kobi?
Thank you so much, Jayda, and thank you everyone who's watching this. Um, every Black History Month, as there's more like national talk about Black history, it's our responsibility as revolutionaries and as people fighting for Black liberation to clarify certain things, to set the record straight on certain things. Um, there's always politicians and corporations who are eager to use the names and faces of historical Black revolutionaries, and to diminish the politics of their actual lives, their actual goals and what they were fighting for and what they were fighting against. For example, Cory Booker yesterday tweeted a quote from Fred Hampton. It's a very famous quote. The quote goes that we don't fight racism with racism, we fight racism with solidarity. And obviously, Cory Booker didn't include the rest of that quote. The very next sentence says, we don't fight capitalism with Black capitalism, we fight it with socialism. So obviously someone like Cory Booker is not gonna propagate the revolutionary content that Fred Hampton was trying to talk about, and that of course the United States government eventually killed him for. And there's so many examples of this because systematically, people are educated to have this watered down view of Black history, and if they know anything about Black resistance, it's just sort of in the abstract, and just a list of names and faces, but nothing about their actual revolutionary struggle. One of these things is that this myth that Black people were completely okay with being enslaved until Abraham Lincoln came along and said that slavery was bad, and now the Civil War happened and now we're free. Obviously, Black people had a lot more to do with their own liberation, with their own emancipation, and it's still on us to fight for freedom today. So there are certain things that are not in that are not in the historical records that are taught in schools, or that are portrayed in mainstream media. Things like, in the hulls of slave ships, people were rebelling. Africans were rebelling against these people who had just captured them. So in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, these people are fighting against people with swords and guns and cannons, and these people are unarmed, they're chained up, and they're fighting back, right? And in some cases, they even managed to actually take control over the ships and steer them back to Africa. And when they arrived in America and in the Caribbean, they immediately began escaping. And once they escaped, they started fighting against being recaptured. And their natural allies in this fight were indigenous people who didn't want their land stolen by settlers. So between 1739 and 1858, that's over 100 years. That's the entirety of which it includes, the start of America as a state to the Civil War, and the ostensibly the end of slavery. During that entire time, Black and indigenous people were banded together in the South, fighting against recapture, especially in Florida and in the Carolinas. The U.S. Army and various white slave catching militias were completely unable to capture these people. They could kill some of them, but they couldn't win the war because the desire for freedom that these Black and indigenous people had was just too powerful to overcome with, no matter how superior their weaponry was, no matter how much more money they had or more equipment, they could not capture these people. And of course, during the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of Black people fought against the Confederacy because they knew that in order to gain their freedom, they couldn't. It wasn't just a matter of negotiating with their oppressors. They weren't just going to argue with slave owners. They had to actually physically fight them in order to get free. So these people who have now in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, these people who historically have been given credit for ending slavery, they made deals with plantation owners. They gave reparations to people who had formerly owned slaves while giving absolutely nothing of what they had promised to the actual people who had been enslaved. And they withdrew federal troops from the South who had been aiding in Reconstruction until that point, and they allowed the KKK and plantation owners to have complete control, complete domination over the South, and that led to segregation and Jim Crow. And again, history written by our oppressors portrays that as just a kind of empty period until Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came along and said, you know what, this segregation thing is really bad and we should stop doing it. And all these white people listened. When in reality, the police, who recently police agencies, including like the CIA, the Department of Defense, who have historically been incredibly racist institutions. On Dr. King's birthday, they were posting quotes taken out of context. They were posting his name on various social media sites. And these are the same people who have been beating protesters the same way that Dr. King was beaten back in the 50s and 60s. And this movement, of course, it wasn't just about Dr. King as an individual. It was about the movement of Black people in the South and all over the U.S. They were there were sharecroppers who were still working on these plantations where their parents had been enslaved, who were fighting sometimes physically with armed struggles, fighting to keep their land and to keep their livelihoods and to keep their freedom and to gain more freedom because they were still oppressed under segregation and Jim Crow. But something I actually skipped over is the Haitian Revolution, of course, which is something that a lot of even revolutionaries don't talk enough about the Haitian Revolution. And something that's interesting about it is that as it was happening, while Black people were physically taking the land of Haiti and removing slave owners from that land, even abolitionists in France didn't believe that it was possible for slaves to lead themselves to freedom. So, of course, after that, it was plantation owners and various colonial governments, various slave owners and white supremacists. They didn't want people who were still enslaved in other Caribbean countries and in the US to know that people had been rebelling and that people had actually gotten free in Haiti. Because if people knew what was happening in Haiti, they would say, well, why can't we do that here? And a lot of the time that was ineffective because people travel, people who had rebelled in the South and were captured and sold to different plantations, they arrived there and they immediately started organizing and teaching other people how to rebel as well. So that's kind of the basis for the distortion of Black history that we see today, is that these slave owners, hundreds of years ago, could not allow themselves, they could not allow the people that they had enslaved to believe that slaves could do anything but work. You know, they had to hide the history in order to maintain their status as oppressors. And obviously that's that same system that was put in place by these slave owners, you know, it still exists today. So jumping back to the 50s and 60s, um, there was the Black Power movement, um, you know, along with the civil rights movement that directly challenged these white supremacist power structures. And you know, something that you learn when you look throughout the history of white supremacy is that whenever Black people take a step forward, whenever we uh, go even an inch toward liberation, there's a white backlash that includes murders, that includes torture, that includes people being confined, people being separated from their families, um, and just every kind of repression, every kind of degradation that you can imagine. That's what is included in the white backlash. So slave rebellions were often met with mass executions, with people being sold to plantations where they would live for maybe 5 years before they were literally worked to death. Um, and after um, after the Civil War, the white backlash took the form of the KKK and of segregation and Jim Crow laws. Um, and after the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, um, we're still living in that white backlash. The backlash is in the form of mass incarceration and in the form of militarized policing. But as hard as they try to, as much as they backlash, as hard as they try to stem the tide of Black rebellion and of Black liberation, um, it's just not possible. As was shown last year in 2020, as Aislinn already said, we had the largest rebellion in history, just in terms of numbers. Um, so what that shows us is that at no point have we ever stopped fighting, and at no point will we ever stop fighting. The resistance um, against white supremacy, against capitalism, against colonialism is as old as those systems itself, and the resistance will continue until those systems are gone. And it's important for us to remember that, because that that the way that our stories are told is something that our oppressors cannot help but telling our stories that way. Um, so obviously we can't rely on our oppressors to tell the truth about our history. So we have to tell our own stories. We have to write our own histories. And even in the moment, uh, we have to tell our own stories about what is happening on the ground. You know, whenever someone is shot and killed by the police, um, immediately the mainstream media and police departments collaborate to make a narrative that paints this person as a criminal, and that tries to justify their murder after the fact. And we have to be vigilant in standing up against that, and in saying that no, this is a white supremacist execution that happened in our streets. And beyond that, what we learn from all the distortions and the realities of Black history is that we're not going to get free by waiting for someone else to free us. No politician, no corporation, no super genius individual is going to free us. We have to, as a people, mobilize and free ourselves and fight for self-determination, in order to, uh, decide what safety looks like in our communities, to decide what education looks like in our communities. Um, I actually had some more written down, but my laptop is about to die. So all I'll say is all power to the people. Thank you everyone for watching this. And it's up to us to free ourselves. No one's going to free us but us. Thank you.
Thanks, Kobe. Yeah, so much of our history, especially our radical history, gets whitewashed, so it's so important, for the stories that we do have, to learn them and understand that, like, as we struggle against capitalism, that so many people have been there before us, and to learn from that history of what went wrong, what went right. And what Kobi was just saying, reminded me of Black Bolshevik, which is Harry Haywood's biography. That's on my reading list of finishing it up, that book, but certainly so far a lot there. So in order to advance from rebellion to liberation, we must not forget the international character of the rebellion that was sparked in 2020. With that, I am very happy to introduce our third speaker, Jazmine Salas of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and also Freedom Road Socialist Organization, who will talk about the rebellion that broke out in May and how it expressed itself in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. Jazmine?
Hello, everybody. Que lo que, mi gente? My name is Jazmine Salas, as Jayda said. I'm here with the Alliance and Freedom Road. So I am going to take you all, talk about it internationally, take you all on a little trip. But before we do that, I feel like we would be remiss if we did not take this time to talk about what's happening in Chicago. And I'm talking about the Chicago Teachers Union. And I'm talking about the fact that currently, we have teachers who are fighting to protect the lives of their Black and brown students, right? Because CPS, let's be very clear, is majority Black and brown students. So they're on the front lines fighting for their lives, fighting for the lives of their students and their communities to make sure that remote learning continues or reopening is done safely, to make sure that students aren't at risk, teachers aren't at risk. I know we all know what's happening in other states due to COVID. We're hearing reports of teachers who are dying, students who are getting ill, and that's already been happening here in Chicago with the schools that are already open. So we need to be sure that, especially our brothers and sisters in the teachers union are safe, and that our communities are safe and the students are safe. So we stand in unconditional solidarity with CTU. Shout out to CTU, and thank you so much for your commitment to liberation, not just Black liberation, but also to the liberation of all oppressed people. With that being said, I am going to talk about the uprising, and also just some historical pieces about policing in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, as well as in Cuba. So first, we are going to talk about Puerto Rico. So the uprising in Puerto Rico, there were a lot of protests that occurred demanding justice for George Floyd. And I'm going to talk about one in particular that was very significant. And that was the protest that occurred in June 1st in Loíza. Loíza is a town in Puerto Rico that is known as the center of Afro-Boricua culture and history. And actually, Loíza, that protest that occurred on June 1st, was actually one of the first cities in Latin America to actually have a protest in solidarity with George Floyd. And when you look at the history of Loíza, when you look at the way that Black folks live, the conditions that they're experiencing, it makes total sense, right? So just to give you a little bit more context, Loíza was actually founded by cimarrones, or runaway slaves in the 18th century. And like I said, it has the largest Afro-Boricua population in Puerto Rico, and it proudly expresses its African heritage. But unsurprisingly, residents have also historically endured poverty, racism, and police violence. And the death of George Floyd was extremely painful because it served as a reminder of this oppression. The Villa Cañone neighborhood in particular has experienced brutal police abuse spanning back decades. Um, and there are a few cases I'm just going to talk about. There's the case of Edgar Pizarro Rivera, who was a 27-year-old Black man with a disability who was beaten and pepper sprayed by police as he rode his bicycle. And then there's also the case of Jose Ayala Rivera, a 22-year-old Black man who was shot in the head by police as he returned home from a party. And Afro Boricuas, we see the parallels between George Floyd and especially Afro Latinx people in Puerto Rico, see the parallels between their own experiences with the Puerto Rican police. But in addition to Afro Boricuas, Dominicans who live in Puerto Rico are also living under police occupation. Dominicans have started migrating to Puerto Rico, some as a way to get entry to the US, and others just to relocate to Puerto Rico. And a lot of the neighborhoods where Dominicans live are heavily policed. And also for context, 30% of the Dominican population is estimated to be undocumented. So that's also an issue as well. Um, but just to give you that context, I do want to talk about the June 1st vigil because it was very, very beautiful. It was organized by Colectivo Ile, which is an anti-racism group in Puerto Rico, and Revista Etnica, the first Afro-Boricua magazine. The protest featured bomba, and bomba was actually something that came up consistently in Puerto Rico as well as in the diaspora when folks were organizing protests in solidarity with George Floyd. That was a common theme. And bomba, for those who don't know, is a traditional African dance that is actually the first original Puerto Rican dance that ever originated directly from Puerto Rico. And it was created by slaves to communicate with each other and to also aid in slave uprisings as well. So it has a very rich and very Black with a period history. Um, Additionally, this June 1st vigil also had a community altar. And some of the things on the altar, there were apples dripping in honey with brown sugar, I'm sorry, brown cigar. Guess I'm a little hungry. We had apples dripping in honey and a brown cigar placed as offerings. Um, and also a handwritten Yoruba invocation to the ancestors. And George Floyd's photo was on this altar, and also photos of other police murder victims, including Aldofina Villanueva Osorio. Aldofina was a 34-year-old Black Loincena, or a woman from Luisa, who was killed by the Puerto Rican police in 1980. Her death is one of the most infamous cases because Aldofina was displaced from her home, and many of the residents who live in Luisa see the parallels between what she experienced as well as what they are currently experiencing. But I'll just quickly give you a backstory as to, the case and what happened. Aldofina was displaced from her home because a wealthy landowner claimed ownership of her property and sold it to the Archbishop of San Juan to build himself a summer home. And one morning, 16 police officers arrived on the scene, and when Aldofina's husband asked the police commander why he was there, he said, "Los vamos a sacar vivos or muertos," meaning we will remove you, dead or alive. Um, and so police surrounded the home and they began shooting inside. And Aldofina was shot 16 times in front of her children. And the family's home was taken down immediately. But the Archbishop's summer home was never built because when construction began, residents would come every night to dismantle the work that was put in, and then builders eventually gave up. So that lot, even to this day, is empty. And as I mentioned, Loencinas see their struggles in Aldofina and George Floyd. And the June 1st action wasn't just an action in solidarity with George Floyd, it was a calling out for Black liberation. And as Aldofina's sister Martha said, George's plea is Aldofina's plea. And the following day, on June 2nd, protests occurred outside of former Governor Wanda Vasquez's mansion in Viejo San Juan, in Old San Juan. Organized by the Colectiva Feminista. The protest called for justice for George Floyd, of course, as well as an end to racial discrimination in Puerto Rico. The crowd broke curfew and even busted out a guillotine. That's what I'm talking about. Additional protests occurred in Puerto Rico throughout the summer and in the diaspora in New York, Chicago, and Orlando, just to name a few major cities. Um, so that's a little bit about Puerto Rico. We are gonna hop on over to the Dominican Republic. We're gonna take the ferry. For those who know, you know. The Dominican Republic has a long history of discrimination towards Haitians and Black folks in the DR. Because to be Black in the Dominican Republic is to be considered Haitian. And so Dominicans are taught to distance ourselves from our Blackness because of that. Um, and Haitians who currently live in the DR are economically and racially exploited to the benefit of the Dominican bourgeoisie. Discrimination against Haitians usually comes in the form of narrow-minded Dominican nationalism that favors Spain and our colonizer roots. A group of Dominicans of Haitian descent called Reconocido held a protest on June 10th to demand justice for George Floyd. They were met by a group of nationalist counter-protesters in a violent confrontation, including the ripping of signs and stealing of flowers and just general violent harassment. The Dominican police were present, of course, and they violently arrested two members of the group, Ana Maria Belique and Maribel Nunez. And they were released hours later, thanks partially due to social media pressure and also pressure from other activists in the DR. Um, and even though this was a very tough situation, I think it is a sign of progress. The fact that there was even a George Floyd protest period in the DR, I think speaks volumes. And we are starting to see more organizing from Afro-Dominicans as well as Dominicans of Haitian descent, organizing for their citizenship and for their other rights. So I think progress is occurring, even though it is occurring very slowly. Um, and so right now I want to transition to talking about Cuba, because I think the parallels when you look at Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the US, and the Dominican Republic, which is a capitalist country, and Cuba, which is a socialist country, are very, very, very clear. Um, so Cuba has handled racism and white supremacy different than other Caribbean countries. In Cuba, the revolution is in power and has been for nearly 60 years. And the working class is in power, but the revolution is still in progress. Um, I will say that the pattern of Black people being killed by police officers in Cuba does not exist. But before Castro's revolution came to power, it did. Prior to 1959, under the dictatorship of Batista, the Cuban police had a brutal history of operating with impunity. They even had a torture site under their police headquarters and would regularly kill Cuban people. The revolution ended this abuse and put the police under the control of the Cuban working class. And policing in Cuba looks radically different than the US because police officers, for one thing, are trained to prioritize the well-being of the people. Instead of having an us versus them mentality like the US police, the Cuban police consider themselves part of the people, part of the community. And actually, police officers need to be vetted by the community before they can even serve on the police force. For context, Cuba is organized almost block by blocks through committees to defend the revolution, or CDRs. And the community will have input as to whether or not an individual will become a cop. So your neighbors have to vet for you, your family may have to vet for you, because they want to make sure that if you're not qualified for the job or if you're not a good person, heaven forbid, then you should not be a cop. And it's more of a collaborative effort between the CDRs and the police force. Um, I was fortunate enough to travel to Cuba in 2019, where I learned and I saw that racism in Cuba still exists on a personal and cultural level, but the government has banned racism. So, like, from the government perspective, racism is outlawed, it's illegal. Um, And because of that, the government has taken steps to fight for Black liberation on a global scale and has done so historically. And of course, in response to this killing, to the death of George Floyd. Um, During the summer, Black Cubans and government leaders condemned the killing, including Cuba testifying against systemic racism in the US at the United Nations. And Black Cubans were also seen on Cuban TV showing solidarity with Black people in the US. And the killing of George Floyd, as well as the protests that occurred over the summer, were regularly broadcasted on Cuban TV. So I'll stop there. I think I'm a little bit over time, but thank you so much.
Yeah, you were a little bit over, but you could have kept going. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that perspective and bringing that to light. Um, just about like international solidarity is so important, and it's also important to like reflect on what's going on in Cuba and what's going on in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, because they're in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, they're facing that same oppression that we are. And to contrast that, with Cuba and the situation before the revolution and after the revolution is so important. And I thank you for that. With that, I'll introduce our final speaker, Frank Chapman of the Freedom Road Central Committee, intern director of the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression, and field organizer for the Chicago Alliance. Frank Chapman will speak about the history of the Black national movement and the manifesto that was sounded in May and June calling for rebellion and toward a liberation struggle. Frank?
Thank you very much, Jayda. I'm so honored to be on this program and to speak to you all. I want to thank the audience too for participating and all of the tremendous contributions made by the speakers who went before me. I had a tremendous moment of enlightenment here. I want to talk about the unfinished revolution and Black liberation today. Actually, this is the I'm going to present to you some excerpts from the epilogue of my book that's coming out. Rumor is it'll be published within the next 48 hours, and it's Marxist-Leninist perspectives on Black liberation and socialism. It's about two historic revolutionary movements in our country, and that is the fight for Black liberation and the fight for socialism. But before speaking directly on the great spring-summer rebellion of 2020, let me provide some historical context by reviewing some of the main points in my current book. And I'll just get right into it. War, as the saying goes, is the midwife of revolution, but the Civil War was the revolution. Now, let me say what I mean by that very quickly, because it often gets misunderstood. What the Civil War did, in fact, do, it abolished chattel slavery, the buying and selling of human beings. It didn't abolish all forms of slavery, and if you read the 13th Amendment, you'll see in there that they say slavery is abolished except for people who have been convicted and put in jail. So we still have slavery in the United States in terms of penal slavery, and it's right there in the 13th Amendment. But that being said, the Civil War was a revolution insofar as it did abolish the buying and selling of human beings. The North responded to the treacherous act of war perpetrated by the South with a war to save the Union. and the slaves responded with open rebellion. It was reported that on the Magnolia Plantation in Louisiana, not only did Black people refuse to work, but proceeded to erect gallows in the slave quarters because they believed they must hang their masters to be free. Black people, despite Lincoln, made the Civil War a war against slavery. At the conclusion of his monumental work, Black Reconstruction, Dr. W.B. Du Bois observed, and I quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery," unquote. That is, was moved back towards slavery by the terror and violence unleashed by counter-revolution. A counter-revolution so mean-spirited and so driven by the Southern barons of white supremacy that it sought to erase from history books and history the great historical achievements of Black people in the most earth-shaking revolution of the 19th century. All revolutions have enduring accomplishments. Counter-revolutions, no matter how thorough and reactionary they are, can only retard the start and stall the revolutionary process. They cannot stop the revolutionary process. As Fred Hampton used to say, you can kill the revolution, you can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. So what were the enduring accomplishments of the Civil War that set the stage for radical Reconstruction then and a large part of the strategy for Black liberation now? It was adding the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which respectfully abolished chattel slavery, that's the liquidation of property and human beings, provided equal protection of the laws, making citizenship a birthright, and guaranteeing the right to vote. These amendments, plus the federal statutes creating an enforcement mechanism for the rights of citizenship, have been the basic enduring revolutionary accomplishments of the Civil War era. Enduring in this sense only. They're still on paper. You know, I don't mean enduring like they've been enforced. From the short-lived political revolution of Black Reconstruction to the present, the enduring accomplishments of Civil War that ended chattel slavery and opened the radical era of Black Reconstruction have haunted the movement for Black liberation. Every movement that is taking root with the masses of Black people has had to do with Black self-determination and the rights denied us as citizens. That is, the freedoms that were half-heartedly given, but wholeheartedly taken away with the end of Reconstruction. Whether we're in the turn of the century, 1900, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or the present, the cry has been for freedom, justice, and equality, for the full restoration of those citizenship rights and privileges we were granted by Congress. We have been quitted this particular legacy of struggle because in the wake of the counter-revolution that ended Reconstruction and established a reign of terror, a system of dual sovereignty whereby the southern states under the banner of the Confederate flag were granted the right by executive fiat and judicial decrees to legally set up a regime of racist oppression and political repression of Black people. This system, which came to be known as Jim Crow, was blatantly enforced by lynch mob terror and a police state apparatus designed to control Black segregated communities in the South and throughout the nation. We submit that the mass Black rebellion that started in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others occurred within the historical context outlined here and above and throughout my book, and that it must be examined from the standpoint of this historic tension this historic tension created by the denial of equality and the national oppression of Black people, because this is the driving contradiction of every Black-led rebellion since the birth of this nation. Civil rights, and especially the right to vote, have been historically suppressed to keep Black people oppressed as a nation. The Great Rebellion of the spring summer 2020 was not just a moment of outrage over the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. It was a clarion call for freedom, justice, and equality, a manifesto coming from the masses in the streets. The placards in the street protests carried messages of defiance. One said, "Resist fear. We are many, they are few." Another said, "Our enslaved labor built this nation. We can end it." We are now in a phase of struggle which some, like the Reverend Dr. Barber of North Carolina, would characterize as a struggle for the third Reconstruction. We think it is deeper. We think it is the youth sounding the death knell of the racist police repression that stands like a blockade in the road to Black liberation. It is a call for mass resistance to the police terror that has stalked our communities and denied us the organizing space we need as a nationally oppressed people to wage the struggle for Black liberation, to finish the unfinished revolution. We are in a pandemic where over two people a minute are dying from COVID-19. Disproportionately, most of the people dying are Black due to the wretched conditions of poverty, homelessness, poor health care services, and massive unemployment. The social unrest agitated by these conditions is being addressed with racist repression and police tyranny. These are the material conditions that gave rise to the Black-led rebellion of 2020, where 26 million people protested and took to the streets in all 50 states of the United States. However, the importance of the working class character of the rebellion must be emphasized. In Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Baltimore, Jacksonville, and Tallahassee, Florida, Detroit, Atlanta, Portland, and many other urban centers of resistance, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of white workers participated in this Black-led rebellion alongside Black workers. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic devastation that follows in its wake has exposed the fact that racism offers no material benefits or privileges to the millions of white workers living in poverty and suffering from massive unemployment. To be sure, what is really going on is that the present crisis in healthcare and economics has spawned the economic conditions like in the 1930s. They will unite workers on the picket lines and in their respective communities and enable them to find common ground in the struggle against national oppression and monopoly capitalism. This is the last of this. I'm ending it right here, Jayda. I see the look on your face. Okay, we believe that now we stand in the rosy dawn of a new movement to finally finish the unfinished revolution that was the Civil War of 1861. Since the overthrow of Reconstruction, that is, the ending by violence and terror, the revolutionary gains of the Civil War, there is a whole other history of alliances and compromises between the old former slaveholding South and the high finance Northern capitalists to continue the oppression and super exploitation of Black people. This is not 1861, this is 2021. But we live in the shadow of the unfinished revolution started by the Civil War. We go forward. We believe Black people united with class conscious workers and Marxist Leninists must muster the masses firmly and unequivocally putting forth an agenda for Black and brown liberation and a class struggle agenda for hundreds of millions of workers who are dying and suffering from this pandemic crisis and economic devastation. The merger of the Black liberation movement and the class struggle is the pathway to socialism. Workers and oppressed people of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. All power to the people.
Thank you so much, Frank. Yeah, like as Black revolutionaries, I feel that task of like finishing that unfinished revolution and taking that struggle up, that has been handed down to us. It feels so overwhelming sometimes. And I'm so excited to read that, to read your new book that's coming out. Like there's just so much there, and I wish you could read more of it actually. But and oh yeah, so in the next couple of days, Frank's book will be available on Amazon. It's not up to right now as we speak, but in the next couple of days is when it'll actually be released for everybody to buy. The title of the book, just to say it again, is Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism. You can search either for Frank Chapman on Amazon, or you can put in the full name of the title. So, and I want to remind everybody, please share this with your friends. Please, send out links to folks. But right now we're going to start the Q&A section of today's event. And I think we're gonna, and let's see, we're gonna open it up by asking a question to all four of you, and that's, how can our viewers help support Black liberation? Frank, do you want to go first?
You're muted, Frank.
Okay, what's the question again?
How can our viewers support Black liberation?
Well, the best way to support it is by joining in the movement. So I would encourage you to join Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Also, you can go to our website, the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression, and join that organization, which is a mass defense organization for Black liberation. So we strongly encourage you to do that. That's the way to join it, is to get in the fight. Oh, may I mention one thing, Jayda?
Oh yes, absolutely.
My book that you just mentioned is online now.
Oh, awesome!
As of
awesome.
Right now.
I'm gonna put it my order in right after this.
Okay.
Get a couple. I'm getting a couple, and I'm gonna because I know folks will borrow and then I want to return it. So. Thanks, Andy.
Oh, sorry about that.
Would anyone else like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, just to support what Frank said, like if you want to fight for Black liberation, like just organize. I don't know if there's people watching this from outside of Chicago, but Freedom Road is national. The National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, is national. If we're not in your city, somebody is. So you're a lot stronger fighting with a whole bunch of other people than you are alone. So if you want to advance the struggle, then definitely find some people, link up with them, and get organized.
Thanks so much, Kobi. And does anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay, I think we can move on to our next question. Then, so here's an interesting question: is to say, well, what role does the Black bourgeoisie play in Black liberation? How should other classes relate to them? Who would like to answer that one?
I could start, and then
Oh, go ahead, Aislinn.
So the Black bourgeoisie, like the bourgeoisie as a whole, allegiance is to the ruling class, is to capitalism. Their interests are in securing their positionality. There's a concept of transversing that class allegiance intentionally, which is called commonly class suicide, which is to intentionally politically align with the working class. And so that's a political choice that members of the Black bourgeoisie can make. And that is an important consciousness in understanding the dynamics of class structure, class stratification, that is important and necessary in advancing the fight for Black liberation, because we have to understand the intricate interplay of the creation of Black oppression in this hemisphere and globally, and the emergence of capitalism, both as in the United States as well as globally. The slaveocracy was how the United States was able to enter into the world as a major economic power and eventually a superpower. Mm-hmm. And so it is necessary for us as a people to understand why capitalism, and because we are in this country, why US capitalism necessitates Black subjugation. And that means that we must be able to understand class structure and also interrogate the Black bourgeoisie, and not cease holding the Black bourgeoisie also complicit in the subjugation of Black people, and specifically the Black working class, which is the majority. The Black bourgeoisie is a very, very small percentage of the Black population. So that consciousness is important, and members of the Black bourgeoisie can commit to, the symbolic phraseology of class suicide by aligning themselves with the Black working class.
Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. I always say, it's like the tools of our masters won't free us, so unless they make that commitment, to betraying the rest of the bourgeoisie class, and it has to be honest and not, some kind of lie, they got no place in the movement. But would anybody else like to add to that? Somebody from Freedom Road?
I keep forgetting to put this thing on. Yeah, can I add to it very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah. I see Black people as a nationally oppressed people. That's where my Marxism-Leninism takes me. And as a nationally oppressed people, we have to see the role of the Black bourgeoisie in that context. I agree with what Aislinn has said, but I just want to add that sometimes the black bourgeoisie can play a progressive role insofar as they are fighting against our national oppression. Uh, what has been the recurrent mistake in our liberation movement, in my opinion, historically, has been that we have not fought hard enough for the leadership of the black working class in the uh, movement for black liberation. And so historically, just pay attention. Who has assumed the leadership of the struggle for black liberation has been the black bourgeoisie, by and large. Now there was exceptions to this in the South during the 30s, and there were also some exceptions to it in the 60s, but I won't get into that. But I'm just saying that now in this moment we ought to absorb those lessons and engage in a very conscious struggle to make sure that we keep the working class in the forefront of the struggle for black liberation. That's the only way to keep the black bourgeoisie honest. uh, or maybe honesty is not the word. Maybe consistent with the demands of the black liberation movement would be a better way of phrasing it. Because I don't know how you can keep any bourgeoisie honest. But yeah, so that's it.
Thank you, Frank. So we have another question and is, will the potential reopening of Chicago public schools have a disproportionate effect on Black students and parents? Who would like to answer?
Yes. So it's important to point out that, um, I mean, it's kind of obvious. Black people in Chicago are extremely exploited and extremely oppressed, and the school system is definitely no exception. I think schools on the South and the West Side, which are where the majority of Black students live, are often in the worst conditions. And the majority of Black students and Black parents have opted to stay at home and continue their education remotely. So yeah, that's also important to point out the fact that, like, not only are Black folks in Chicago, um, experiencing harsh conditions, they're also the biggest group demanding that their children stay home.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything to add to that? I think that covers it so well, but want to give an opportunity. Okay. So I think we can move on then to our next question. Um, what are the most important principles and practices that socialists, particularly Marxist-Leninists, should uphold while working to support the Black liberation movement, particularly those that get ignored or discarded by the so-called white left?
I can start this one off.
Sure.
So the first thing that came to my mind is upholding self determination for oppressed nationalities, including the Black folks in this nation, in the U.S. who are oppressed as a nation. I've noticed a lot of white people on the left, and it's a form of white chauvinism, to often have harsh criticisms or use their criticism as a justification for not supporting Black liberation movements. And I think we need to keep in mind that, the folks who are on the front lines, engaging in struggle, are the ones who understand their conditions the most, and the ones who, through practice, have developed the scientific understanding necessary to continue their struggle. And while people are allowed to have criticisms, I think it's important to understand the need to be principled, and the need to understand that oppressed people have the right to fight for their liberation by any means necessary.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Okay. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was well put, Jazmine. So well put. Before we move to our next question, I want to remind folks to please put your questions in the Facebook chat. If you want to address it to someone in particular, just let us know. Otherwise, we'll just have all four of our speakers chime in. So for our next question, what organizations, campaigns, et cetera, do you think are contributing to Black liberation today? And I know this was touched on already a little, but who would like to take that? Kobi, are you up? You haven't taken one. Do you have anything to add to what we said earlier?
I mean, if you're gonna call me out like that, sure. I mean,
I'm
obviously,
making sure your voice is heard there.
the Road Socialist Organization is, where, like I said before, we are national. We're in California, we're in New York, we're in, there's a bunch of us in Florida. We're all over the Midwest and all over the South. So, we are doing that work. There's a lot of organizations. I don't think we have the time to name all of them right now. But, there's been some, and I think Aislinn could actually talk about this like better than me because she's been more involved in this. But there are a lot of people in Black Lives Matter organizations in different cities around the country that are doing great work that have had their differences with the national organization. So yeah, there are. I mean, there's so many organizations that are doing the work for Black liberation, and I think there's a quote from Kwame Ture where he said that no organization is. I mean, bad organization is better than no organization at all. So a lot of people have, they have their critiques of this or that organization, and they might be right, but if they're not organized themselves, then they have no way of actually implementing a better plan. So even if you are in even if you are in a place where FRSO is not there, if the National Alliance is not there, and you join an organization that you think has like maybe some liberal tendencies, struggle, struggle and do what you can to make sure that organization actually fights for liberation. Yeah, so that's all I have to say on that question.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay, we're going to move on to our next question that we have, and is, how do you see the Poor People's Campaign and Black liberation collaborating together in the future? Is that okay? That is Black liberation collaborating together in the future. Does anyone would anyone like to take that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
Go ahead, Frank.
Well, first I want to clarify one thing. I think the Poor People's Campaign came out of the Black Liberation Movement. So I don't see them as like separate entities that have to come together necessarily. They are together. They started out together. The Poor People's Campaign was started by the Black Liberation Movement, has historically been led by the Black Liberation Movement, and that is true to this day. I think Reverend Barber and those people are clearly, obviously, and squarely in the Black Liberation Movement, and they're also leading the Poor People's Campaign. It was started by Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy back in the 60s. So we in the National Alliance have historically worked with them as opportunity presents itself, you know, and so we've always encouraged the Black organizations that we work with to support the Poor People's Campaign. How could you not support them? It's part of the Black Liberation Movement, the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Did anyone? Okay.
Seemed like you
So
were
far,
frozen in time.
oh, go ahead. What was that, Frank?
On my screen, you froze. You froze for a split second.
Oh,
But it's okay now.
okay, thank you. So I think we can move on to our next question. And this is, does moving from more spontaneous struggle to organized mobilization risk sacrificing the energy of the more movement-driven struggles? If so, how can organizations combat that from happening? Thank you all for doing this. This was amazing. Who would like to go first?
I'll try, because this is like, I've been having conversations with people about spontaneity for like since the rebellion started, and you know, there's like we first have to like get clear on like what spontaneity is, you know, what spontaneous uprisings are. You know, people are gonna rise up as long as there is oppression. You know, people will spontaneously rise up, but it's once that spontaneous rebellion happens, um, you know, it can go into like an organized, sustained, that momentum can carry into an organized, sustained movement, or it can be co-opted. And you know what happens, a lot of what the problem has been, since uh, you know, for now that we've been living through like 100 years of COINTELPRO, like McCarthyism, mass incarceration, like, you know, militarized policing. All the purpose of all of these things is to stop us from organizing, and if they can, to stop us from rebelling. But you know, and once they've taken out, you know, our organizations, you know, they dismantled the Black Panther Party. They a lot. There's some organizations that are still around today that I'm not. I don't want to badmouth anyone, but you know, they've gone through a lot of restructuring at the hands of the U.S. government, and you know, then like these nonprofits and these government institutions step in, and you know, take this like radical energy, and they like take it around in some circles and put it right back into something that's going to be ineffective. So what our responsibility is to make sure that that turns into a sustained movement instead of getting co-opted. And that's what Frank said about working class leadership and Black leadership. We have to make sure that those are present in these movements, because they will every time get co-opted if we don't make sure that if we don't carry that momentum forward.
I'd like to jump in on this.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. And I would argue that I agree with what Kobi said, and I would argue that all movements are co-opted unless you're able to build sustainable struggle. That's the entire goal of the systems of oppression, which is to stop the resistance movement. And we can look to, we should study history. We should study the movements of the past. We should study the revolutions of the past, and we should study the struggles that are happening concurrently right now. So we can look to Bolivia, we can look to Venezuela, we can look to what's happening in South Africa, we can look to Cuba, we can look to, you know, these places across the world that have demonstrated how to win, how to overthrow oppressive systems, how to sustain. And we can look to our own histories on how they're co-opted and how they're suppressed. Spontaneity, the reliance on spontaneity and the fetishization of spontaneity lends itself toward never structurally changing anything. Because you have to have an organized people to continue the maintenance of that change. We can have a spontaneous, and we have had spontaneous uprisings that have not lessened the amount of Black people killed by police or have not freed any people from incarceration. It has dramatically and very emotionally shown to the world how outraged we are, but it hasn't unseated any government officials. It hasn't opened any cages. It hasn't degunned police forces yet. That's movement work, that's organized struggle. And that takes intention and planning and meeting and weighing strategy and tactic and analyzing the conditions and continually doing that because things are continually shifting. A great lesson for us is to look at, you know, Jazmine already talked about the Cuban Revolution and how the committees in defense of the revolution were created was because the United States attempted to overthrow the Cuban Revolution through the Bay of Pigs invasion. And it was at the insistence of the people of Cuba demanding, we need to be able to defend what we have fought for. And that means we have to defend it on a Black by Black manner. So we have to be, even though we have conducted this revolution, we have to continually defend it, both politically and militarily. And that's where I think we get into the arguments of the state and the role of the state in oppression. And we can look to, and I think it's important for us to struggle here and to look through where have we seen victories and where have we seen defeats. And there are multiple examples of revolutions that have happened where people have not defended the revolutions. And those revolutions no longer exist. Those socialist experiments no longer exist because they were militarily defeated. So in order to defend our gains, and that's at every level, we're on the precipice of being able to codify the ending of pretrial detention and money bond in Illinois, which would be the first state in the country to do this. We will have to defend this. This is the FOP, police forces and prosecutors are already attacking this, and the governor hasn't even signed this into legislation. So we have to continue to organize even when we have these small wins, which is a big win, right? I don't mean to demean it. So it requires consistent, persistent organization. Relying on spontaneity means that nothing systemically is going to happen because we have no mechanism to defend it. We have to become organized in order to fight for our wins and then to defend them.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You know, spontaneity will not liberate us. You know, and yes, and so many historical examples that you brought up. I know Lenin spent a great amount of time writing about that, as revolutionaries, like not being behind, you know, sort of like following behind the spontaneity of a popular movement of getting out in front. So absolutely 100% agree. And it looks like that's going to be our last question. Does anybody have anything to add to that, that excellent response that that was just given? Absolutely 100% agree. Does anyone have anything to add?
Just one like very small thing.
Mhm.
A lot of the time, like when people talk about spontaneity, what they mean is property destruction. And you know, that's like if we're gonna, you know, if you want things to happen and they're not happening on their own, you have to make them happen, right? So if you want um, things to be destroyed and they're not spontaneously being destroyed, you're going to have to go out and destroy them. And if you're going to do that, you're going to have to be much more organized. And like you have to, just like Aislinn said, like there are so many uh, mechanisms and institutions that the state has to stop people from even thinking about doing the kinds of things that we have to do to get free. So if you know you're not just gonna like we're not gonna spontaneously um, engage in the kind of warfare that we need to. You know that has to be built up very consistently, very painstakingly, and with a lot of um, very intense organization and
Yes,
discipline.
absolutely. Um, all right, so if no one has anything else to add to that, um, okay. I just want to announce again, Frank's book should be available. At least the Kindle version is what I'm being told. And that title, once again, is Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism. You can just search for the title or search for Frank Chapman on Amazon. Um, it will be available as a print paperback for $15.95 or Kindle ebook for $9.95. And I believe the ebook is available right now and the paperback is coming in a couple of days. I would also like to add a few upcoming events. So Frank will be doing a live stream on his book on the National Freedom Road Socialist Organization page on February 14th. Kobi will be doing a presentation on African revolutionary leaders, and that'll be February 21st. And Jazmine will be doing an event on Puerto Rico, a presentation on Puerto Rico, February 27th. So please add those to your calendars. You can find those events on the Freedom Road Socialist Organization page, the national page, and then also the Freedom Road Socialist Organization Chicago page. I believe the last two are on the Chicago page. And I would like to close by saying that if you like what you heard today and you would like to join us in the struggle against monopoly capitalism, if you would like to join us in the struggle against monopoly capitalism and in the fight for Black liberation, please visit FRSO.org/join. We are a national organization of revolutionaries rooted in the mass movement for justice, the labor movement, and the movements of oppressed nations and nationalities. Help us build toward the creation of a new communist party based on Marxist-Leninism to lead the way to socialism and liberation. Thank you to all of our friends, comrades, and future comrades for joining us for this conversation about moving from Black rebellion to Black liberation. Stay safe, stay warm out there, stay healthy. And I thank you all for being here today. And I look forward to struggling alongside of you all. Thank you so much.